Hey, everybody. In this week's episode, we're going to be getting into the subject of death and how to build a healthy relationship with it. So stay tuned. That's coming up next.
Welcome back, friends, to the Wizard Factory video podcast, where you subscribe for weekly videos exploring deeper knowledge and understanding of the universe and ourselves. I'm Logan Hart.
And I'm Brian Easterday.
And if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We'd love to have you join us. So today we're going to be talking about death. Big, scary boogeyman under your bed. This is literally something that every human being has to deal with, contemplate, have a relationship with, right? So we're going to be looking at that, kind of comparing aspects of different cultures and how they deal with death, and how we feel that our modern society has largely become estranged in its relationship with death and have rendered some unhealthy consequences as a result of that. So without further ado, let's get into this. So we're going to start out by a quote by Mark Passio, one of our very favorite teachers. Anyone who's not familiar, do yourself a favor and go to whatonearthishappening.com. Check him out. So Mark said, "The fear of death is the beginning of slavery. The principle of freedom comes before life itself. Most people are so fearful and attached to life that they would give up freedom to have safety, and no amount of safety is worth the loss of freedom." And so why is that important? Why is death so intertwined with, or why is the fear of death so intertwined with the state of freedom? Do you care to comment on that, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really think that this is the fear of death is a kind of a very central linchpin to the control system. And we'll get into, why that is, as we talked about a lot on the show. A lot of that really has its roots in monotheism, and we'll get to that more as we go throughout the episode. But if you can start to shift your worldview and how you look at death, and you step into more of like a pagan or an animist perspective, then all of a sudden death doesn't become something to be feared. It's just part of the process. We can look around and observe in nature that death is always occurring. The seasons change. Like there's always a shift. There's always a change going on. If change doesn't happen, stagnation comes in, and wherever stagnation exists, that's where disease thrives. So death is a very natural and healthy part of the cycle. You could look at it like a doorway. So we'll get into a lot of different, perspectives of how we can look at death, and, look at, kind of some ancient perspectives, or, maybe even bring in some modern perspectives here as we get into it.
Right. So the first thing we kind of wanted to look at to begin painting the picture is, many are familiar with the first law of thermodynamics, which states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred or changed from one form to another. And it's ironic that this is a scientific law that really kind of lends itself towards there being something beyond death, yet most science-minded people tend to be very atheistic and nihilistic. But what this means is that you and everything else is in a constant state of transformation that you have no control over. It is 100% just a fact of everything in matter. What you're transforming into is up to you. So your choices in life directly dictate this. When you make incorrect choices, in other words, in opposition to natural law, things that are causing harm to others or yourself, whether you're just eating badly, that is going to manifest sickness and disease in your body, in your consciousness, your soul, and your environment. And so if you're choosing death in your actions, your body will eventually be repossessed, repoed by nature, and you'll try again. So again, we're just looking at cycles, and this is a very big theme that we're getting into, as far as really looking at the difference between the modern viewpoint, especially Western Christian or monotheist minded viewpoint, to the ancient and traditional pagan mindset regarding death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we can definitely see there's a fundamental assumption and worldview that is very different in these two different mindsets. In the Abrahamic worldview, you have this ultimate God that even though He created you, you have original sin, yada yada yada, and essentially you just have this one short little life, in all of eternity. You have this one, a few little decades, tops or whatever, and then you're going to get judged for all of eternity. Like, that's a totally different worldview than if you look at it, the traditional animist or kind of pagan worldview that looks at reincarnation, that everything is consciousness. Everything has an awareness to it and is here learning its own lessons. And that you don't just have this one opportunity, this one incarnation in order to figure everything out. That there's the understanding that you're probably going to take mistakes, that there's so much knowledge, so much to experience out there. There's no way, it'd be impossible to ever get it in one lifetime. So you have to come back over and over again to get all of those experiences. All of a sudden, when you have that worldview as a fundamental assumption through which you're looking at all of life through, that drastically changes your relationship with death and how you're viewing it, as well as how you're viewing your life. Instead of something that, you're just forced here, you didn't have a choice, and then you're going to be punished like you're pretty much just a victim, versus a worldview where you chose to have experiences because you want to have all of the challenge, you want to experience all the things, both good and bad, the fun things and the difficult things, like that. It just drastically changes how you look at the world. And that's why these two worldviews, they're so radically different. That's why they're, we talked in our coexist episodes, and a lot of people think that you can kind of just blend them all together. Well, when you break them down to the fundamental assumptions, there's some very key things that are just radically different, and you can't really blend them together. It's really a state of cognitive dissonance if you're buying into both.
Right, exactly. So we have on one hand this very stagnant, black and white, one life to live. It's almost like, imagine if you grew up in a world where the only way to have a career is you take a test, and you only get to take the test once. And if you fail it, you can never hope to gain access to that ever, and then you don't get to choose when you take the test or what the terms are. Like, that's your fate. And then, what kind of fair world would that be? Especially when under this same worldview, you have the creator who could make the world or the universe any way that he wants. If he's all powerful, he could set it up however, and this is how he chooses to, where there's no chance to learn from that mistake. Once you take the test, you die, and you have to answer for your life. That's it. Versus now the mindset that observes nature and connects to natural law through personal experience and looking at these systems that permeate everything, and see that death is all around us. Everything is transforming, everything is dying and being reborn again. And, death feeds life, that, it composts and it gives nutrients, and then new life springs forth. Even mythology like the phoenix or something like that, death is what makes that metaphor beautiful, is that it burns up in a fiery glory and then is reborn again from those ashes. And this is really tapping into why this is such a beautiful way to look at this, and not just beautiful, but very empowering as well.
Yeah, to bring in some law of correspondence here as well, I think when you understand that there's the physical reincarnation happening all around us, like you can see trees and plants die, they get turned into soil, and, broken down by fungi and turned into soil, and then new life grows out of them. You can observe it happen, you can see it. But, we've talked a lot about like the hero's journey on this show, and the idea of a psychological death or a metaphoric death, like a death to the self. So these are, very similar, but when you can see that is a cycle, that's a process, not only is that something you go through in the physical, but on a psychological level, you can learn to develop a healthier relationship with death. That seeing death is not actually this, even though it's something ending, it's part of this cleansing process, that it's good for old habits or old thought patterns that aren't serving us to die, and then a new way of being be reborn out of those. So the change that is always happening around us, it's a very beautiful thing to learn to embrace. I mean, how boring would it be if we only had one season? Like our world wouldn't work the same like that. That change always has to be there.
Exactly. And bringing into context the warrior mindset, which we speak a lot about on this channel, which for good reason, it's extremely important to be an empowered person. The ultimate battle that is always going on is that of truth versus ignorance. As a conscious being, that is the ultimate state of transformation that you are undergoing, is going from ignorance into gnosis or understanding. And in this way, death is not just a necessary, but extremely essential part of this process. By putting to death old beliefs and paradigms that don't serve your path any longer, for something to be put to death, it must give way to a new thought, a new idea, or a new way of being, because it came about through a realization of that, which absolutely devastated the old idea, obliterated it into obsolescence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's a beautiful thing, to look at, in fact, like in slightly off topic, but in astrology, even there are certain nakshatras that are all about this kind of death energy, this Kali energy, this destroyer. But they serve their purpose for, major transformation, and I think we can see a lot of that going on in the world right now. And we're going to, tie that in as well. But the next little thing I wanted to look at is, observing how death is actually part of that healthy cycle. We can observe a process that happens in the body known as apoptosis, which is wherever a cell self-destructs, it dies. And that's very healthy. We need cells after they've served their purpose to die. And whenever they don't, that's actually when disease builds up. We get tumors and cancer and things like that. Those diseases are a result of that stagnation, where that healthy death cycle of the cell isn't actually at play. So even on a physiological level, on the smallest level, like you're constantly dying and being reborn. Like, and that's the healthy state of being. When you don't do that and that stagnation kicks in, that's when disease sets in the body. So, again, with that law of correspondence, we can observe it in the physical as well as, in the mental plane, when that comes to emotional stagnation and things like that we've talked about on the show. So I think that's, it's just another indicator of why stepping into the animist and pagan mindset and observing nature is really the best. I mean, that's how you live in harmony where you are, because we're all in nature. We're all part of it. So by observing it and how it works, then we can choose to live in harmony with it, rather than buying into belief systems that are going utterly against nature, and everything they teach is gaslighting us from what is really around us.
Right. And you can tell everything by the, you know, observing the warrior mindset that uses fearlessness as a virtue, as a something to strive for. Whereas the Christian belief system literally operates on fear. And if its subjects didn't fear death, it wouldn't be an effective control system.
Mm-hmm.
Just, you know, following the pretense that it is that. If you don't agree with that, that's fine. But just think that if it was, wouldn't it be totally rendered ineffective if the people didn't care about dying, if they didn't see it as a bad thing? Because why is it that supposedly if Christians believe that they're a good person, that they're saved and they're going to heaven, why would they actually be afraid if someone pointed a gun at their head? Maybe because deep down their soul actually knows that it's all bullshit, and that they actually, if things turn out, maybe they go to hell, or maybe nothing happens, you know. But I guess that fear of the unknown is really what drives all of this, because all fear is fear of the unknown. It's ignorance ultimately. So knowing yourself, understanding death better, is the natural antidote to that fear.
Well, and I'd like to point out how this is really, you know, what's going on currently in the world, as we've said, has been a really amazing learning process. And I think people have drastically overlooked one of the very key foundational components to how the pandemic is actually operating, like to how governments and organizations and people like Bill Gates are being able to get their control out there. And a lot of the propaganda they use, it's all centered around death and the fear of death. You know, that's a very interesting thing to observe. You know, you'll see, you know, the propaganda, you need to stay at home and save lives, you know, the old people will die. And if, you know, if you're going out without a mask or whatever, that means you don't care about them. Death is a normal process. And now keep in mind, I'm not saying I'm wanting anyone to die, or that if people do die or they do get sick, that isn't a painful thing for families to go through, or a difficult process. But everybody dies, like, from something. Like, it's a normal part of the process. So if you remove that fear of death, if you remove that monotheistic programming that this is the only chance, well, yeah, person, like, that might be difficult. It might be really sad to lose someone, but if you're understanding that they can come back if they choose, well, then, you know, like, their energy force, that life force continues on. That all of a sudden, that it's a great comfort to be able to operate from that worldview. And it doesn't allow you to be controlled as much. If we could apply this to even the government control of them, you know, this is why Rome had to adopted Christianity, and specifically within the military, because that was a very useful way of getting that into the order followers that can then go control the population. The problem they had with a lot of the Germanic tribes is they had this warrior mindset where they didn't fear death. In fact, you know, they were very courageous in battle. A population that has that worldview where they don't fear it, all of a sudden they become a lot harder to control. So having them adopt a monotheistic worldview where there's just this one life, this one chance, and then there's an ultimate judgment at the end, that immediately, like, reins people in control as soon as they accept that worldview and start operating that way. And then that has continued into, like, our modern society, where in the West we're so disconnected from the process and terrified of death that it's really easy for some, you know, a group of people to put out mass propaganda and have people so afraid that they're willing to give up all their freedoms. And it's centered around the centered point of being afraid of death. You remove that fear, and all of a sudden that it doesn't work.
Right. And man, this just hit me too. This realization that you can love your life without being afraid of death. You can care about yourself and love yourself. That doesn't mean that you're afraid to die. You will still fight to defend your life, but that doesn't have to mean that you fear death. That's a huge difference right there. And that's why I see, like, self-defense or protecting your child isn't a, you know, an aggressive act of like, you know, what they say hate, violence is hate. No, that's an act of love for yourself or for a loved one. And by default, like I was saying earlier, if morality is truth, then an immoral action is out of ignorance and therefore in opposition and at war with truth and goodness. So it's a very good, it's a sacred thing. Because I also noticed that there actually are a lot of people out there that are so miserable because they have so much self-loathing that they actually want to die secretly. I actually had a friend like this, very tragic story, very talented music artist, and was constantly writing songs about getting killed or dying or killing himself, or very dark, kind of dark themes in the music. And so he was a super cool guy, but you could tell he was very tormented. Well, he ended up running from the police as a federal fugitive and killing himself in the process. And I think that deep down, he saw that as liberation because he was so tormented in his life. So you can see that, like, even that kind of relationship with death also isn't necessarily a healthy one. So there is that balance of self-care and the fearless warrior mentality.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that brought up a person that I know in my life, that my son's grandmother, his mom was talking to her mother, and she was kind of talking about reincarnation. And one of the things her mother said to her was that, she hopes that's not true because she doesn't want to come back. And this is a woman that's, Catholic, her whole family's Catholic. They have been for generation after generation.
Only someone who sees this place as a prison would actually think that way.
They just don't want to come back, and that it had me thinking that, like, Christianity really worked by creating hell on earth in order to sell the idea of heaven.
Wow.
And what I mean by that, yeah, I thought that was pretty snazzy. But when you think about it, they really did get people to accept such a dark and dismal worldview that they grow to hate this existence so much that they don't want to come back. They just want to be able to get to that idea of heaven, where everything's going to be perfect, and everything will be provided to them by the sky daddy. And that makes a lot of sense of why early Christianity, you saw its adoption among the lower class, tradespeople and slaves and other things like that, because a lot of them lived pretty dismal lives. So then the idea of, oh yeah, this is just, your test, and then, when it's all over, you go to heaven. Well, all of a sudden that, that becomes something that people will then look for. So it's kind of interesting how it can work both ways, that they can use death as both something to fear because there's the potential punishment there, but also as something that if they really hate their life, they can look forward to because there's a potential for reward. So that's it's kind of, it can go both ways in how it's manipulated and used to control people.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And like, you can also observe the way that people are so obsessed with death in a very unhealthy way with their obsession with celebrity deaths. Like, it's like people put on more of a charade for celebrities, people who they've literally never actually met in their personal lives, than they do their own loved ones. And it just kind of blows my mind how much, and especially a lot of these people really aren't very good people and don't really deserve to be revered in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting kind of psychic phenomenon to observe of why that is. And, I think a lot of that can come because there is this kind of this disconnect from having this relationship with death, but that need is still inherently there. It's part of nature. We can't escape it, no matter how many false worldviews we adopt. Like, the fact of it, still remains. And just like we talked about in the episode that we did about order followers, how with the sacred masculine, that that urge to be a protector and to be the warrior, that actually gets played on and then twisted because we don't have our indigenous culture there in order to put that energy into something positive. Well, then in the West, that ends up getting directed and used, and those people end up becoming order followers. Well, much in the same way, death can be played on here, that there needs to be a natural relationship with it. But if the culture does not have that, it's going to manifest in different ways. I think something that's coming to mind now would be, look at TV and all the different crime documentaries, and serial killer things that, people are so very interested, like a lot, those are very, very popular kinds of shows, all the different crime TV shows and things. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, but I think needing to have some kind of a relationship with death, that is, then people are so disconnected from nature rather than seeing it around in nature, like going out in the woods and observing it. They're then getting it through an artificial version through their TV show where they're seeing things being played out.
Right. I mean, people don't even have a very good relationship with life, much less death, which life can actually be experienced, whereas death, when it happens, there's no going back at that point. So very interesting things to look at. And, again, going back to how all fear is ultimately rooted in the unknown or ignorance of a thing. And this begs the question in context of death of what happens when we die. And we've looked at sort of the one life lived, go to heaven or hell model versus looking at nature and seeing how everything else moves in cycles and circles. And then there's also so many other aspects to it we could look at, such as past life experiences. Specifically in children, there's a lot more accounts of that. Children remembering, oh, I was a man and I was in a war and, this kind of thing. You can't really just dismiss that as coincidence or the imagination of a child when there's so many accounts of this, especially, for example, my life partner, her own son had recounted something about being an African tribesman or a warrior or something, and then he got his ancestry results, and there actually was a bit of like 2% African in his DNA. So, I mean, sure, you could say that's a coincidence too, but I mean, you have to at least like ponder these things. It is a bit weird.
Yeah, that brings to mind for me, there's actually a certain tribe that I'm having trouble remembering their name right now, but it's very common within their tribe that they understand reincarnation to such a point that they can consciously choose to come back within certain family lines. So, for example, a family member dies and then they're just reborn into the same lineage. So when we can start to change our relationship with death and start to understand this, we can then bring our conscious will to that. And I mean, the possibilities of that, if you think of the implications that would have on how people view their life and how they go about living, it would drastically change a lot of people's worldview. And that's a worldview that a control system does not want people to know about. For example, like what could you do if you were a consciousness insurgent that understood how to just come back over and over again and just continue that same operation? Well, there's no really stopping you at that point. And that's the truth. There is really no stopping us. It's all an illusion. Right.
And if you want to see the control system fail, give us a like down there. We appreciate it. So getting back to the warrior mindset, because I want to kind of move this towards reframing things. We've sort of unpacked everything at this point and looked at all the pieces, and now we're kind of reframing in terms of what is a better, healthier way to think about death. And, again, with the warrior mindset, understanding that a life lived in cowardice is no life at all. And there's many reasons why that's true. The closer you are to death, the closer you are to life. And contemplating your own death really cultivates a lot of appreciation and gratitude in life, presence, mindfulness, and then as well as drive and motivation and fearlessness. Anytime I'm feeling lazy and I can't muster the drive, I just start thinking about how in a few short years I'm going to be dead, and the only thing left of me will be the imprint that I left on the world. And that's literally all I need to get my ass in gear. That really works. And there's a reason for that. If we were immortal, maybe we would literally just like turn into vegetables, because we'd always fall back onto, oh, I could always do that another day. It's our mortality that really gives so much meaning to the short lives that we have.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, what a beautiful way to look at that. And that's something that I myself have done a lot in my life as well, of like thinking about death and then like using that as a motivation to do things. Like even when I was a young child, I always felt that like, I only have so much time. So I have like a certain mission, or like there's a lot I have to get accomplished and I just can't waste any time. So I've always been on some sort of like adventure, like I was always doing different things in my younger years and going places. But, I think there's a lot of beauty in learning to contemplate death and a lot of value in it. Even if you think about, imagine this as like a technique. Say you were in a relationship or you were having an argument with someone. Like imagine what it would be like if you lost them. Well, all of a sudden it like probably brings a lot more value to that relationship, where you're like, well, maybe this little petty thing that I'm upset about or that I'm triggered out isn't really worth holding on to. Like maybe I should let that go, because you don't know when you're going to lose that person. I think that can be a very healthy way to start to integrate death, and to start to bring more value to your relationships. For me, I always think about death, honestly, or I always have throughout my life. It's been a big thing. I have, like five major planets all in the 8th house there, which is like the house of death and transformation and things like that. So it's a subject that really does kind of fascinate me to ponder and think about. But I think when you do that, you can start to resolve a lot of those unknown feelings, or you can start to come to terms with things a lot earlier, rather than just trying to avoid it as something that like, yeah, I know it's going to happen, but I just hope it's not today. And then you're always just hoping it's not going to happen. Well, that's remaining in ignorance of it, or you're trying to avoid it, rather than just understanding it's part of the process and that you're trying to get the most out of every moment that you have. That's a lot better way to go about operating, in the world.
Yeah. Those are excellent points. I definitely feel you on I've had this thought myself when arguing with my partner, that, if we said our piece, if we had an argument and left a little bit sour, and then they went out and died in a car crash or something like that, would I be thinking about the thing they did that pissed me off, or how much they meant to me and how badly I wish I could have them back? I mean, that can be true, and that can be thought of at any given moment. It's there as a tool if you choose to tap into it at any time. And another thing that hit me that when you were talking about your 8th house placements and everything, that you said it's the house of death and transformation, and I kind of thought, well, transformation is that natural process that's always occurring, but we can temporarily suspend that process if we so choose it, even though it's literally insanity, because it's going against the natural cycles of things. And what that leads to is stagnation. So either way, death marks the end of a cycle, but you can either be in tune with that and ride the waves in a very healthy way, or constantly be trying to fight it and living in that toxic stagnation, and then meet your death anyways.
Right. Exactly. And that's been a major life lesson for me, is like learning how to embrace change and these cycles. And that's why it's such a central theme, and why I love the pagan or the animist worldview so much. Like, and not only in like astrology, like you can pull like your tarot birth cards, and my first one is the Wheel of Fortune. So it's all about that change, that cycle. It's just a theme with that. I myself as a soul, like I wanted to come to kind of understand that and really dig into that kind of perspective and those lessons. So, and that's, it's been a theme in my life. I've experienced or seen, death or, things like that, especially like when I was in the Marine Corps, there's definitely, you'll see guys that will commit suicide or, just totally lose their shit. And, it can be very difficult to like see those things, but at the same time, like those bring like a lot of valuable lessons. Like you'll even see like with people who, like combat veterans, a lot of times going through that experience will actually like make them appreciate life so much more, so that they're like, when I'm done with this, I just want to go back and have my family. And you saw that like a lot after World War II. There was kind of that whole generation that when they came back, they had experienced that. And they were like, I just want to settle down and raise a family and have a nice house and, and things like that. And there's, so there is something to be said of that kind of apophatic learning, process of it.
Absolutely, man. And another way we can kind of frame this as well is that death is an end, but it's also a beginning. So we have the first part right. Normally, it's the second part that we're missing. So understanding that separation is real, but it's also an illusion. Ultimately, the transition of one thing to the next, like the difference between your wrist and your hand. Well, that those are different things, but can you tell me exactly where my wrist ends and my hand begins? Or two waves in the ocean. Well, what is a wave? Is it really a thing, or is it just a surge of energy in the ever-changing allness of the ocean? Or like moving down a hallway from room to room when it's really all just the house. It's that complicated simplicity. Everything is the same in a different way. You can see things for what they are from both the micro and the macro. And that's what we're talking about, tapping into the understanding the fragility and the brevity and shortness of life, while also understanding the endlessness and interconnectedness of your life and everything else around you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, having both of those components is really essential. Like I said, it's not either or, it's both. That's that theme, that we keep coming back to. It's not, we have to get out of looking at things from this very simplistic black and white perspective and start being able to see both the complexity and the simplicity and all the nuance and the gradients. Like that's definitely a good way to put it.
I want to offer a small exercise for the viewers in an attempt to maybe shift how you think or feel about death. And this could be scary. It could be difficult, upsetting. And maybe it takes a few times, but I think that there's really a lot of medicine in that, especially if it's upsetting. That's all the more reason to work in that difficult space and navigate your way through it instead of avoiding it, really. And what that is to literally imagine your own death. Like, close your eyes, imagine that you died. Imagine it vividly with every single detail. See your mother crying and what dress she's wearing, and see yourself there dead and pale and gaunt and laying in the casket, and like feel that. Allow yourself to feel that, and then accept it. Make peace with it. It's going to happen. It's not if, but when. And the more you do that, the more you're sort of desensitizing yourself in a way to the stigma about what that would be like. You're imagining a reality that you subconsciously, at a very primal level, don't want to be true. So why would you ever want to imagine that? But literally just using your imagination to sort of simulate you making peace with your own death is something that has helped me personally, and it's something that I try to do often, and I recommend it to anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good, I would say a very healthy practice to do, for sure. But yeah, that's going to summarize this episode up, for us. So essentially, it's really all about just being able to shift that worldview and develop a healthy relationship with it. Realize it's a doorway. It's just part of the process. It's not something that should have to be loathed and feared. and there's no sky daddy that's going to punish you for eternity when it happens. Like, you're here because you want to be and you want to experience things. So if you enjoyed this episode, give us a like, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts. What are your experiences with death? How do you view it? What are some useful things that, you have used to develop a healthier relationship, with death? We definitely want to hear from you guys in the comments below, and be sure to, as well, remember that we have services available, that really helps us continue to buy better equipment and keep things going and creating content like that. So, you can find all the different services and products that we have available at thewizardfactory.com. So be sure to check that out as well. That's going to wrap us up for this week. So until next week, be empowered, be inspired, and be encouraged.